How do you screw up Superman? I'm not talking about a couple of bad Superman movies. I'm talking about decades of missed opportunities. Why does one of the most iconic characters ever created keep flopping at the box office? Batman, Spider-Man, even Aquaman have billion-dollar movies. The worst Thor movie outgrossed the highest-grossing solo Superman movie by nearly $100 million. Superman should have been DC's golden goose. An origin story with the heart, an instantly recognizable look, spectacular powers, action, adventure, drama, and 85 years of history to pull from. But his cinematic record, it's a graveyard of failures, reboots, and incompetence. In this video, I want to explore the Man of Tomorrow's cinematic history, from the golden age of cartoons to when Richard Donner made us believe that a man could fly, to the collapse, the revivals, the failed attempts at revivals, and what the future holds. Long before Christopher Reeve made us believe that a man could fly, Superman was already on the big screen in animated form. His cinematic story goes back to the early 1940s when Action Comics #1 led to the legendary Fleischer Superman shorts, animated by Fleischer Studios and distributed by Paramount for theatrical release. These were the very first Superman movies in a way. They made 17 shorts in total, the first 9 by Fleischer, the last 8 by Famous Studios after the original team dissolved and Max and Dave Fleischer left. Even back then, Superman had behind-the-scenes drama. These cartoons weren't just popular either, they were groundbreaking. They're still considered some of the finest Golden Age animations ever made. The first short even ranks 33rd on the list of the 50 greatest cartoons of all time. They were pricey, each 7 to 10 minute short cost up to $50,000 in 1940s money, or more than $800,000 today, but they were certainly well worth it. Their influence was massive, and they helped define Superman's iconic style and inspired artists like Alex Ross and shows like Batman the Animated Series and Superman the Animated Series, which are arguably some of Warner Bros. Animation's best work, not to mention some of Superman's best work. They also gave Superman his power to fly. Originally he just leapt over tall buildings, but animating that was difficult, so the studio asked to make him fly instead, and the rest is history. If you want a deep dive into this era, Captain Christian's visual love letter on the Fleischer Superman is a must-watch. I've linked it below, but the bottom line is, these cartoons didn't just entertain, they shaped Superman's legacy forever. More importantly, they proved that he had a future on the big screen. The Fleischer cartoons wrapped up in 1943, but by 1948, Superman was back on the big screen, this time in live-action form. His first live-action appearance was a 15-part serial starring Kirk Alyn, released by Columbia Pictures. Altogether, it ran about 4 hours. Serials were basically old-school miniseries that you had to see in theaters. Each short episode ended on a cliffhanger to keep audiences coming back every week. And did they ever. These were cheap, fast, and popular productions. The budget was so tight that instead of filming Alyn flying, they just cut to animated footage whenever Superman took off and landed. When he landed, he was always obstructed so they could cut to the live-action Alyn. But audiences didn't mind. The serials were a hit, spawning a sequel in 1950 called Aquaman vs. Superman. Sure, they're dated now. They're not as stylish or as beautiful as the Fleischer cartoons either. But they proved something important. Superman could work in live action. He could sell tickets and build a legacy on the big screen, and not just in cartoon form. In 1951, Superman got one last film before Donner's era, Superman and the Mole Men. It wasn't a cartoon or serial, it was the first proper Superman movie, even if it was only 58 minutes long. But really, it was a test run for TV, then a new medium for entertainment. DC, then National Comics Publications, wanted to see if Superman could work on the small screen. Turns out, yes, he could. Smashingly, in fact. In 1952, Adventures of Superman premiered with George Reeves in the cape. Now, despite similar names, George Reeves and Christopher Reeve weren't related. George's last name was Reeves with an S, while Christopher's last name was Reeve without the S. Now, is it ironic that the letter S is the difference between their last names? No, not really, just a neat coincidence, but I digress. The show almost didn't happen, but cereal giant Kellogg's stepped in to sponsor it. It ran for 6 seasons until 1958. The flying effects were low-tech, but clever. Wires, springboards, rear projection, anything to sell the illusion, though we still could not believe that a man could fly. The passing of George Reeves in 1959 ended the run. It's a shame. The show was fun, inventive, and turned Superman into appointment viewing, with families gathering around the TV to watch it. Sure, it's dated and campy now, but Reeves' Superman was warm and charming, exactly what the Man of Steel should be, and what many miss. After Superman and the Mole Men, Superman was absent from the big screen for 27 years. There were still cartoons like the New Adventures of Superman and Super Friends on TV that kept him relevant though. But then came the big one. Richard Donner's 1978 masterwork, Superman, changed everything. It had the famous tagline, "You'll believe a man can fly." It was right. Starring Christopher Reeve as the Man of Steel with an iconic John Williams score, it cost $55 million, the most expensive film ever made at the time, and earned over $300 million worldwide, or more than $1.4 billion today adjusted for inflation. It proved that superhero movies could be huge and set the gold standard for them at the same time. Donner got Superman. He balanced mythic sci-fi, small-town coming-of-age, and light romance, all while keeping the character's warmth and sense of duty. Roger Ebert nailed it, quote, "Superman is a pure delight, a wondrous combination of all the old-fashioned things we never really get tired of. Adventure and romance, heroes and villains, earth-shaking special effects, and, you know what else? Wit," end quote. Superman creators Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster were ecstatic. According to Shuster, quote, "I got chills. Chris Reeve has just the right touch of humor. He really is Superman," end quote. And according to Siegel, quote, "It's exactly as I imagined it," end quote. Getting there was not easy. Richard Donner was not the first pick, and Christopher Reeve had to beat out hundreds of names including Muhammad Ali, Al Pacino, and Clint Eastwood. Luckily, they got the right guy. Reeve didn't just look the part, he made Clark Kent and Superman feel like two real distinct people. Nervous, bumbling Clark versus confident, inspiring Superman. It's a standard that no one has topped since. Behind the scenes, it was chaos though. Producers Ilya and Alexander Salkin and their partner, Pierre Spengler, clashed constantly with Donner. Superman 1 and 2 were being shot at the same time, but this led to the production stretching from 8 months to 19 months. Doubling the time meant a significant increase in budget. The flying effects alone cost $2 million, while Marlon Brando and Gene Hackman's combined salary was more than $5 million. That's a big chunk of the $55 million budget right there. But the costs were the producer's problem. Donner only had one thing on his mind, to make the best movie that he could. He trashed Mario Puzo's 500-page script as soon as he took on the project, saying of the Salkins and Spengler, quote, "The way these people were making it was a defamation," end quote. The Salkins blamed Donner for going over budget and schedule. Donner said that they never gave him a budget or a schedule. All that friction came with the price. Donner delivered a classic that made the world believe in Superman again, but he lost his job before he could finish Superman 2. 1980 Superman 2 is not a bad film. Actually, it's pretty good. It's not as sweeping or as grand as the first one, but Terrence Stamp's General Zod makes for a better villain than Gene Hackman's Lex Luthor. But Superman 2 was a movie caught in a tug-of-war between two Richards. Richard Donner, who shot most of it while filming Superman 1, and Richard Lester, who ended up finishing it. Lester was known for his comedies and was brought in to mediate between Donner and the producers. He and Donner got along pretty well. Donner would ask Lester for advice, and Lester got everyone focusing on finishing Superman before worrying about the sequel. But behind Donner's back, the Salkins and Spengler made their move. Donner said, quote, "One day I got a telegram from them saying my services are no longer needed and that my dear friend Richard Lester would take over," end quote. Loyal crew members like Tom Mankiewicz and editor Stuart Baird refused to come back. Even John Williams left after he clashed with Lester. To be fair, Lester is a great director. His version of The Three Musketeers is considered to be a classic, and considering the chaos involved, it's a miracle that Superman 2 is as good as it is. But some scenes use Donner's footage and others use Lester's, shot 2 years later. There are continuity errors and it's a patchwork film. Unfortunate, as it could have been so much better. Despite all the drama, Superman 2 was another box office hit, just not on the same level as the first. It made about $216 million worldwide, a steep drop from the first film's haul. It was a sign that Superman's magic was already starting to wane, but the real trouble was still to come. If Superman 2 showed cracks, 1983 Superman 3, also directed by Richard Lester, was an identity crisis. This time, the villain was Robert Vaughn's Ross Webster, a bland industrialist trying to corner the oil and coffee markets, with Richard Pryor as a bumbling hacker sidekick. Pryor alone got $5 million of the $39 million budget. Christopher Reeve wanted out after Superman 2, but was roped back in when the Salkins threatened to sue him. This time, he had his lawyer renegotiate, and they had no choice but to keep him. Reeve was Superman, after all, and so he got a bit more creative power on this movie. Speaking of which, this movie leaned really hard into the slapstick comedy that Lester loved. Leonard Maltin called it, quote, "an appalling sequel that trashed everything that Superman was about for the sake of cheap laughs," end quote. Aries magazine summed it up, quote, "Compared to the first film in the series, everything about Superman 3 is a joke. A harsh, cruel joke played on all the people who wanted to see more of the Superman they saw a few years ago," end quote. The opening credits alone, a long sight gag sequence, the kind that Lester enjoyed, set the wrong tone. It was downhill from there. To be fair, it did have sparks of good ideas, like splitting Clark Kent and Superman with synthetic kryptonite. One thing that makes Superman interesting is his self-control, his ability to hold back. Putting an uninhibited Superman front and center was an interesting idea, but the movie tried to juggle too much and wasted it. The result, an $80 million box office on a $39 million budget, a huge drop from the first two films. But Superman's slide was not over yet. There was one more movie left in the tank, unfortunately. 1987 Superman 4, The Quest for Peace, directed by Sidney Furie, was the final nail in Superman's cinematic coffin, and it would stay shut for nearly 20 years. It came out just 3 years after Supergirl bombed, and by then, the Salkinds and Christopher Reeve both felt that Superman had run his course, especially after the backlash to Superman 3. The Salkinds sold the rights to Canon Films, who brought Reeve back with a $6 million payday, plus funding for his passion project, Street Smart. Canon immediately gutted the budget from $36 million to $17 million. Test audiences hated the first cut so much that they chopped off 45 minutes, leaving a cheap, sloppy mess. Critics tore it apart. Rotten Tomatoes sums it up, quote, "The Superman series bottoms with The Quest for Peace. The action is boring, the special effects look cheaper, and none of the actors appear interested in where the plot's going," end quote. The Washington Post was even harsher, quote, "More sluggish than a funeral barge, cheaper than a sale at Kmart, it's a nerd, it's a shame, it's Superman 4, end quote. In his biography Somewhere in Heaven, Reeve didn't hold back, quote, "Superman 4 was a catastrophe from start to finish. That failure was a huge blow to my career," end quote. And in his autobiography, Still Me, he wistfully remembered the Donner days, saying that under Donner, they'd have shot big scenes on real streets with real crowds, not on cheap backlots. It was a huge blow to Superman as a film property. Superman 4 is still ranked among the worst movies ever made, and its failure made studios terrified to touch the character again for decades. Not that they didn't try, though. After Superman 4, the Man of Steel got stuck in development hell for nearly 2 decades. At the same time, Batman rose to the top, fell back down, and got right back up. A sequel to Superman 4 was planned, but Canon's plans for Superman 5 fell apart before they even got started. Canon collapsed after a number of flops, and that was that. So the rights reverted back to the Salkinds. They tried with Superman the New Movie, later retitled Superman Reborn. This version would have brought in Brainiac, killed Superman, and resurrected him in Kandor, years before DC's Death of Superman comics arc. But they lost money on a movie, Christopher Columbus, The Discovery, and they folded as well. In 1993, riding the hype of Death of Superman, Warner Brothers bought the rights and handed Superman to producer John Peters. Peters brought on John Lemkin, who wrote Superman Reborn. It was weird. Superman dies fighting Doomsday, his life force enters Lois, and she gives virgin birth to a new Superman who grows into adulthood in weeks. Lumpkin said, quote, "In any good Superman movie, the fate of the whole planet should be at stake. You've got to have villains whose powers and abilities demand that Superman, and only Superman, can be the one who stops them. That's the only way to make the movie exciting and a dramatic challenge," end quote. Stories where the planet is at stake are boring, because we already know how it's going to end. Either the hero saved the world and lived happily ever after, or the hero sacrifices themselves and the planet survived. But when the stakes are personal, you care. Superman is compelling because he's a godlike figure with deeply human fears and flaws. Action Comics 870 is an excellent example. In it, Jonathan Kent dies of a heart attack saving Martha. Clark hears her cries too late, rips through a mountain, but can't reach them in time. The cover says it all. Half Superman, half Clark Kent, shoulders slumped, knees bent. All that power, yet he couldn't save his dad. That's Superman. Powerful but human. Heartbroken, trying and failing when he was needed most by the most important people in his life. It's a question almost everyone has asked themselves at least once. If I had superpowers, what kind of person would I be? Superman has them, and seeing him come to terms with them, what he can do and what he can't, are what make him fascinating, not the powers in and of themselves. WB hated Lumpkin's script, so they brought on Kevin Smith, maybe the biggest comic nerd in Hollywood at that time. But working with John Peters was chaos. Peters wanted Superman not to fly because he thought that it made him look like a Boy Scout. He wanted Superman to fight a giant spider in the third act. Why? Because giant spiders fascinated him, so much so that the ending to 1999's Wild Wild West, which he produced, is a fight against a steampunk giant spider. He wanted Sean Penn as Superman, a Brainiac fight with polar bears, and a Chewbacca-like sidekick. Peters later admitted, quote, "I didn't realize the human part of it," end quote. Smith's version, Superman Lives, almost happened with Tim Burton directing and Nicolas Cage starring. Both signed pay-or-play deals, but it died before cameras rolled. Superman was still stuck, and it would stay that way for years to come. Burton brought in Wesley Strick to rewrite Superman Lives with a more philosophical Superman and a villain called Lexiac, but the budget ballooned to $190 million. By April 1998, WB had blown $30 million with nothing to show. Burton quit, saying that he basically wasted a year. Still, pay or play meant that he was guaranteed the $5 million he had signed on for. Peters kept trying, but the only legacy was the documentary The Death of Superman Lives, What Happened, and a cameo of Nick Cage's Superman and the Giant Spider in 2023's The Flash movie. Then, in the early 2000s, WB tried not one but two new Superman projects. One was Batman vs. Superman Asylum. It was dark. Bruce had retired, Gordon, Alfred, and Dick Grayson were dead, and Clark was divorced from Lois. Bruce's new wife is murdered by the Joker, sending Batman back into the shadows. Lex Luthor manipulates the chaos, turning Batman and Superman against each other before they team up to stop him. The studio wanted Johnny Depp as Batman and Josh Hartnett as Superman. The other project was Superman Flyby, written by J.J. Abrams. This one rewrote the mythology. Krypton never blew up. Instead, it had been torn apart by a civil war between Jor-El and his brother Kata-Zor. Superman dies, comes back, and fights rogue Kryptonians on Earth. It was meant to launch a trilogy, but every big name had basically turned it down. One abandoned project after another. Superman just could not catch a break, but then a miracle happened. Sort of. After 19 years, Superman finally returned to theaters in 2006 with Bryan Singer's Superman Returns. WB figured that Singer, fresh off of X-Men, would get it right, and he mostly did. But he also made the choice to position it as a direct sequel to Superman 1 and 2, ignoring everything else. You can already see the problem. Brandon Routh played Superman, Kate Bosworth was Lois Lane, and Kevin Spacey took a turn as Lex Luthor. Superman's been gone for 5 years, and when he comes back, Lois has moved on and Lex is up to his old tricks. It's actually a pretty good Superman movie, certainly one of the best, but that's not really saying much. Routh, of course, did not replace Christopher Reeve, but his more vulnerable, lonely Superman was refreshing after the campy Lester years. Tarantino loved it as well, and apparently wrote a 20-page review. Seeing how the world had moved on without Superman is a genuinely interesting idea, a bit like Alan Moore's Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow. But then, it falls back into the same old world-ending stakes. Lex Luthor's plan is basically a remix of his scheme from the first film, reshaping the world's geography for profit and power. It's underwhelming, especially after 19 years of waiting. The real miss was that this should have been a Superman for a new generation. Sure, it was 19 years after Superman 4, but it was 26 years after Superman 2 and 28 years after Superman, which were the ostensible predecessors. This was a perfect moment for a fresh start. Even Singer later said, quote, "If I could go again, I'd do an origin. I would reboot it," end quote. But during the Smallville era, WB probably assumed that everyone knew Clark's story, so they called it Superman Returns. But no one really knew where he was returning from. And, as a quick aside, and speaking of Smallville, Superman has always thrived on TV, from Lois and Clark to Smallville to the animated shows. They focus on Clark's humanity, not just his powers. But that's another story. This one's about his rough ride on the big screen. Returns made $391 million on a $223 million budget. Not terrible, but nowhere near Superman or Superman 2 adjusted for inflation. Nostalgia alone wasn't enough, and after 2 decades, good wasn't good enough either. The bar was spectacular, and Returns did not clear it. Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy set the tone for DC's modern movies. People say that Nolan's vision was dark and gritty, but that's just scene dressing. Looking at it closer, both Donner's Superman and Nolan's Batman are similar. Both of these films are very earnest movies. They're about heroes inspired by guiding lights. Bruce has his parents, Alfred and Gordon, and Clark has Jonathan, Martha, Lois, and Jor-El. Nolan's Batman is not a cynic. In fact, his fans are more cynical than he is. Bruce is an idealist who believes that Gotham can be better. Superman just wears his idealism on his sleeve. Both heroes are mythic symbols who want to inspire. Studios seem to miss that. They see the darker color palette and think that audiences want grimdark versions of every character, as if dark equals mature, which is about as immature a take as one can have. But besides Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, Wonder Woman and Aquaman, the rest flopped or fizzled. To carry the torch for the DCEU, Nolan brought in Zack Snyder. Snyder's Man of Steel was a post-Dark Knight Superman for better and worse. Henry Cavill looked the part, a dead ringer with real weight in his performances. The action finally delivered the Superman that we imagined as kids, powerful, fast, larger than life. I also think that Snyder captured a solid part of Superman's relationship with his parents. One of the best scenes in the movie is his reaction when Martha is threatened. It's raw, explosive fury, the kind that you would expect to see from someone protecting the last family that he has left. Was killing Jonathan Kent with a tornado dumb? Maybe not. In the comics, the heart attack works because it's sudden, something Superman can't stop. The tornado is different. Clark could have saved him but didn't because exposing himself would put him in more danger. Pa Kent stops him, choosing Clark's future over his own life. He will not let his son sacrifice his future for him. He chooses Clark's autonomy over his own life. The depth of love for his son is admirable. The choice scars Clark deeply, which it should. Then there's him killing General Zod. Superman's no-kill code is an old rule, but he has taken lives before. I understand why some have an issue with it, but I'm not sure it's the be-all end-all. My issue with Snyder's Superman is what seems to be an overall lack of agency. I never got the feeling that he wanted to be Superman, but more that it's something that he got forced into. His Superman ends up feeling distant and deified, not human and not aspirational, though I think Snyder sometimes gets too much hate. He got a lot right, even though I might disagree with many of his stylistic choices. Man of Steel made $670 million on a $258 million budget, but reactions were mixed. It would be a long, slow road to an ignominious end for what turned out to be a decent enough interpretation, even if it doesn't aspire to the same greatness of Christopher Reeve or Richard Donner. Man of Steel came out a year after the Avengers, and DC panicked. Instead of taking time to build a universe, they cancelled a proper sequel that would have featured Brainiac and jumped straight to Batman vs. Superman: Dawn of Justice. They stacked the deck, Jesse Eisenberg as Lex Luthor, Gal Gadot as Wonder Woman, and a doomsday fight to echo the death of Superman. But bigger did not mean better. A.O. Scott, writing for the New York Times, wrote most incisively, quote, "But the point of Batman vs. Superman isn't fun, and it isn't thinking either. It's obedience. The theology is invoked not to elicit meditations on mercy, justice, or sacrifice, but to buttress a spectacle of power, and in that way the film serves as a metaphor for its own aspirations. The corporations that produce movies like this one, and the ambitious hacks who sign up to make them, have no evident motive beyond their own aggrandizement. Entertainment is less the goal than the byproduct, and as the commercial reach of superpower franchises grows, their creative exhaustion becomes ever more apparent." End quote. He nailed it. Batman vs. Superman committed cinema's worst sin. It was boring, and I say that as someone who's watched Gods of Egypt and the Transformers movies multiple times. I like good spectacle, but dull spectacle, that is unforgivable. The effects were fine, but the movie was forgettable, despite Snyder's longer director's cut getting a warmer reception. Still, it made enough to keep the machine rolling into Justice League. Then came tragedy. Zack Snyder stepped away after his daughter's passing. Joss Whedon took over, but the finished cut was a disjointed mess that made $661 million on a $300 million budget, a disaster given the star lineup. The later Snyder cut fared better, but it was too late. Superman was barely Superman in either film, just an icon standing around. The poor showings killed any sequel plans, and Henry Cavill's Superman faded out with them. It's too soon to tell if James Gunn's Superman will make him soar again, though first signs look promising. Even if it does, it'll take years to see if Hollywood finally understands him. Superman is fascinating, but so easy to get wrong. Studios look at him and think, he's too powerful, make him weaker. Too perfect, add flaws. Too simple, make him complicated. Too optimistic, make him dark. Every fix makes him worse. Here's what they keep missing. Superman isn't interesting because he's powerful. It's what he does with that power that makes him interesting. His appeal is his fundamental decency, not his abilities. The best Superman stories understand this. Clark Kent isn't the disguise. Clark is the real person. He's the farm boy from Kansas who loves his parents, works a normal job, and wants to do the right thing. Superman is a job, but both sides are essential to who he is. When movies flip that, when they treat Clark as the mask, they lose what make him relatable. We don't connect with him because he can fly. We connect with him because he chooses to use that gift to help, to catch a falling plane instead of just beating traffic. He's not above us. He's one of us with all too human worries and all too inhuman power. Superman has always mattered, but maybe he matters more now than ever. We live in an age of cynicism, division, and moral ambiguity, trussed up as quote-unquote the real world. Superman stands for the opposite: earnestness, hope, unity, moral clarity. He's not impartial, he's opinionated. Nor is he outdated. He's proof that power doesn't have to corrupt, that you can be strong and kind, and that tomorrow can be better than today. Hollywood could use some of that right now, so could the rest of the world.